6 handkerchiefs. That's the number that turns this story from expedition into accounting. Not a myth, not a rumor. An entry in a man's own words. A soft currency traded in a hard place for a life that never had a signature on any treaty. And that forces the big question that will govern everything you're about to see. How did a mission sold as rescue, clean, scientific, civilized, become a machine that devoured people, then tried to bury the teeth marks in paperwork and silence? In the late 1880s, Africa wasn't opening to Europe. Europe was closing its hands around Africa. The conquest wasn't only guns and flags. It was contracts, committees, and moral language. In 1885, the Congo became a particularly pure experiment in that kind of power. A whole country presented as free, while functioning as private property. When a territory belongs to one man's ambition, ethics don't disappear. They get repackaged as a slogan. This is the world that manufactures the private expedition. Not purely state, not purely business. Something more convenient. A venture that can claim heroism and deny liability. If it succeeds, it becomes proof of civilization's virtue. If it fails, it becomes an unfortunate adventure, and the empire keeps its hands clean. Enter Henry Morton Stanley, celebrity explorer, master of logistics, and, most dangerously, master of narrative. He knew what the public wanted to hear. He could sell a march through disease and violence as a moral pilgrimage. And Europe wanted a story like that, because it needed to believe its expansion had a soul. The pretext was Emin Pasha, governor of Equatoria, stranded by the Mahdist revolt that had shattered Egyptian control in Sudan. In newspapers and salons, Emin became a symbol. A good man trapped behind chaos, a reason to send men into the interior under the banner of salvation. A committee formed, funds moved, officers were chosen. Stanley gave speeches about benevolent purpose. No conquest, no destruction, only rescue. But rescue, in empire, always comes with cargo. Look at the route, and you can see the betrayal before the first step. The expedition could have approached from the east. Instead, it pushed through the Congo, through Leopold's domain, because that corridor served business as well as mission. The expedition carried prestige and science on the surface, and underneath it carried leverage, relationships, trade expectations, and the quiet promise that whatever maps were drawn would later become claims. This is what civilization looks like when it is honest. A supply chain with a moral mask. And then the expedition did the one thing that turns a bad plan into a catastrophe. It split itself. A forward column to push toward Emin, a rear column to hold supplies and keep the blood pumping. On paper, it's rational. In reality, it's the moment brotherhood becomes bureaucracy. The moment you create a group whose job is to be forgotten. Because if they suffer out of sight, the main story stays heroic. That split is where the cover-up begins. Because the rear column becomes the place where crimes can happen without witnesses, where hunger turns men into kidnappers, where discipline turns into cruelty, and where the civilized mind learns a new reflex. Erase, deny, move on. By the time the public hears the truth, 2 key men will be dead. One will be remembered as a madman, one will be defended as a gentleman. And the system that enabled both will try to walk away untouched. because the oldest trick of power is this: make the horror look like an exception, so the machine can keep running. Before anyone bleeds in the jungle, the bleeding starts on paper. Europe doesn't enter the Congo like a barbarian smashing a gate. It enters like an accountant opening a ledger. Treaties, seals, committees, associations with noble names. This is how conquest learns to speak politely. The Berlin Conference doesn't need to shout, "We are stealing." It just needs to redefine words. Commerce becomes humanitarianism, occupation becomes protection, and a private man's ambition becomes an international free state. In that language, violence is no longer a crime. It is a cost of doing business. And once power is written down, everyone can pretend it was inevitable. That's why the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition is so revealing. Because it's the perfect hybrid of the late 19th century, part rescue mission, part corporate venture, part propaganda performance. It was never a purely British crusade, never a simple humanitarian march. It was a project that needed respectable faces to move through an immoral system. And it found its perfect face in Henry Morton Stanley, famous enough to attract money, hardened enough to do what the money required, skilled enough to keep the public story clean. The expedition was organized the way you would organize a business deal. Officers were selected like executives. Funds were raised through committees and patrons. Supplies were counted, weighed, inventoried. The point wasn't only to reach Emin Pasha, it was to make the journey profitable, or at least politically useful, to the men financing it. That's the first betrayal. Rescue is announced, but the route is chosen for leverage. If you want to see where the mask slips, follow the map. The obvious approach to Equatoria was from the east, but Stanley's expedition moved through the Congo, through Leopold's private domain, down the artery of the Congo River. That wasn't geography, it was policy. Moving through Leopold's territory meant the expedition could be fed, housed, and staged by Leopold's stations. It also meant the expedition would reinforce Leopold's claim. Every successful march, every portage trail, every negotiated passage was another thread binding the interior to his network. A rescue mission becomes infrastructure. Infrastructure becomes control. And control always demands logistics. So, Stanley arrived with modern tools and modern certainty. Yet, he arrived into a system that wasn't ready for him. Communications were unreliable. Promised boats weren't prepared. Local trade was hostile. The expedition expected cooperation the way an empire expects oxygen, as a natural right. But the Congo was already a battlefield of economies. Arab-Swahili trade networks, local power rivalries, European stations, and the constant threat of raids. To call it uncharted was a lie. It was charted by violence. This is where the expedition makes its most poisonous alliance. Tipu Tip was not a neutral local helper. He was a major trader with deep networks of ivory, influence, and enslaved labor. He knew routes, commanders, markets. To Stanley and Leopold, that looked like efficiency. To people living along the river, it looked like the return of a nightmare. When a rescue expedition arrives with a man associated with slave raiding and forced transport, you don't see salvation. You see the supply chain of captivity walking back into your village. So, trade collapses, trust collapses, and the expedition's civilized solution is the same solution empires always use when consent fails. Coercion dressed as necessity. You can hear the logic forming. We are out of food. therefore we must take. We are delayed, therefore we must pressure. We are the mission, therefore our hunger matters more than your autonomy. That logic is the second betrayal. The moment moral purpose becomes a license. Now add another ingredient: time. Expeditions like this don't move like cavalry charges. They move like bureaucracies. Every day lost is money burned. Every delay is a crisis to explain back home. The longer the expedition stalls, the more likely the committee's story cracks. And Stanley cannot afford cracks. He doesn't just need to succeed. He needs to succeed in a way that still looks heroic from London. So the expedition begins to operate like a machine, protecting its own narrative. First, it adopts the language of couriers, a polite word that hides what is often coerced human transport. Second, it begins to treat people as interchangeable units of motion: porters, guards, guides, bodies to carry the weight. Third, it accepts the core rule of imperial logistics. When supplies run low, you don't reduce the mission, you reduce the people. And then, Stanley does the decision that turns a difficult journey into a disaster. He splits the force. On paper, it's clean. A forward column pushes to Emin Pasha. A rear column holds the base, maintains supplies, and sends them forward. It's efficiency. It's division of labor. It's a plan that looks impressive in a report. But on the ground, it is abandonment with a signature. Because the rear column is not just support. It is the part of the expedition that gets stuck in limbo. Too far to be safe, too stationary to be feared, too desperate to be respected. It becomes the place where hunger festers, where discipline becomes brutality, where officers begin to suspect one another, and where the first unspoken rule of collapse takes hold. Everyone looks for someone else to blame. In the next part, we enter the moment the expedition fractures into two stories. One that will be published as triumph, and one that will be censored as shame. The front column will march into starvation and pride. The rear column will rot in place and discover what civilization really means when there's no audience. Because once you split the group, you split the truth. The expedition doesn't collapse all at once. It collapses the way institutions collapse, in compartments. One section still believes the mission is noble. Another section is already living in the consequences. And between them, silence, distance, and the slow rot of trust. Stanley's split created two realities. The forward column moved like a spearhead, cutting into the interior with the confidence of a headline: Rescue Emin Pasha, restore order, prove civilization's worth. But the rear column, left behind with supplies, tasked with maintaining a lifeline, was the part of the expedition that had to endure the humiliation of waiting. Waiting for boats that never came. Waiting for promised porters. Waiting for orders that didn't arrive. And waiting is where belief goes to die. From the first weeks, the rear column's situation was structurally doomed. It needed local trade to survive, food, guides, cooperation. But the expedition's reputation arrived before it did. It had traveled with Tipu Tip, a name that carried its own terror across the river routes. People didn't see scientists or rescuers. They saw the shape of a slave economy. They saw a foreign column with guns, ambition, and uncertain intentions. An engine that might demand bodies as payment. So, trade dried up. And when trade dries up, a certain kind of European logic switches on, the logic of entitlement, If they won't sell, we'll take. If they won't cooperate, we'll compel. Hunger becomes justification. Fear becomes policy. This is the point where the mission's moral language starts to betray itself. The rear column began to secure supplies. That phrase is a velvet glove. Underneath it, you get kidnapping, seizing local people as leverage to force food and goods. You get raids framed as requisitions. You get a slow drift into violence that nobody wants to call violence, because that would mean the expedition is no longer civilized. It is simply armed men extracting survival from others. And in that environment, the question is no longer, how do we save Emin? The question becomes, how do we keep order among ourselves while everything outside wants us gone? Stanley left the rear column under a chain of command that looked stable on paper. In reality, it was a recipe for paranoia. Officers with overlapping authority, men of different backgrounds, loyalties, and levels of desperation. Sudanese soldiers, Zanzibari porters, hired labor, coerced labor, camp followers. An entire moving society compressed into a stagnant camp. This was not an army with a state behind it. It was a private enterprise trapped in the field. When private power collapses, it doesn't fall back on law. It falls back on the personality of whoever is holding the whip. That personality was Edmund Barthelot. In the public story, Barthelot was a British officer. Discipline, firmness, duty. In the internal story that leaks later, he becomes something else. A man whose authority turns feral under pressure, whose mind begins to confuse command with cruelty. The rear column needed leadership. What it got was volatility. Punishments escalated. Humiliations became routine. Rage became governance. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most systems of abuse do not survive because one man is violent. They survive because everyone else calculates that confronting him will cost too much. That's where complicity begins, not in ideology, but in exhaustion. Alongside Barthelot was another kind of prestige, James S. Jameson, not a soldier, a naturalist, the grandson of the Jameson whiskey dynasty, a man with money, education, curiosity, exactly the kind of person Victorian society wanted to imagine as harmless, even virtuous. If Stanley is the spear, Jameson is the velvet banner behind it. Science, observation, culture. But a banner can be a disguise. Because when you strip away comfort, people don't become better. They become more themselves. And the Congo was a stripping machine. Heat, hunger, malaria, fear, isolation. It peeled men down to their impulses and then asked them to justify those impulses with the language of civilization. That's the third betrayal, when curiosity becomes an alibi. While the rear column deteriorated, the forward column marched into its own nightmare. Disease picked men off in ones and twos. Skirmishes turned into ambushes. Food vanished. Morale thinned. They kept moving because they had to. Because if they stopped, the entire enterprise would be exposed as what it really was. A well-funded gamble drifting toward failure. The tragedy is that neither column truly understood what the other was becoming. The forward column imagined the rear was stable, supplies coming, lines maintained. The rear column imagined the forward might already be dead, abandoned in the forest, swallowed by distance. And when that suspicion takes hold, a new kind of fear replaces the old one. Not fear of the jungle, but fear of betrayal. If Stanley can't be trusted, then no one can. If orders don't come, then survival becomes personal. And when survival becomes personal, morality becomes optional. That is how expeditions die, not only from disease, not only from arrows, but from the internal collapse of shared reality. In the next part, we follow the forward column as it reaches the man they came to save, and discovers the cruelest joke in the whole enterprise. The rescue target doesn't want to be rescued. The mission's purpose dissolves, but the machinery keeps running anyway. Because once you build a machine of conquest, it doesn't stop just because the excuse fails. The forward column didn't travel, it hemorrhaged. By the time Stanley pushed beyond the last reliable stations on the Congo, the expedition stopped being a mission and became a test of what the human body will do when it's treated like fuel. Men died in a rhythm that didn't feel dramatic. No single heroic last stand, no clean battlefield, just fever, infection, accidents, and the kind of violence that arrives without warning and leaves without explanation. A shot from the tree line, a spear in the confusion, a body that simply doesn't stand up in the morning. And because this was a private expedition, every death had a second wound: the silence. There was no state funeral, no official inquiry that mattered in the jungle. There was only the unspoken understanding that the story back home had to stay beautiful. The march needed to remain civilization advancing, not men being ground down for a political performance. That's the first psychological trick of power. If there is no audience, suffering becomes acceptable. Stanley pushed on because he had to. Not only because Emin Pasha needed saving, but because the expedition itself had become an investment. Sponsors, committees, reputations, these weren't abstract. They were the invisible hands tightening around his throat. Every day wasted, every retreat, every public hint of failure would be a betrayal of the myth that built him. So the forward column kept moving until hunger stopped being a feeling and became a policy. Food ran out in stages. First the good provisions, then the rationing, then the improvisation, then the desperation. The jungle doesn't care about speeches. It doesn't care about maps. It doesn't care about the moral narrative a man is trying to sell. It only asks one question, over and over. What will you do to keep walking? Months passed. The expedition grew thinner. Men fell away. The column that began as a confident spearhead became a line of ghosts dragging equipment through heat and wet darkness, their discipline held together by habit and fear. Eventually, Stanley reached the place he believed would end the story. Lake Albert, the region where Emin Pasha was supposed to be waiting like a rescued symbol in a European newspaper illustration. But in the real world, rescue targets don't sit still. Word arrived that Emin had heard they were coming and moved, shifted position like a piece on a board, and for a moment it seemed the expedition had missed him. That small, absurd detail is what breaks the heroic fantasy. You can travel a continent to save a man and still fail because the man has his own will. The rescued refuses to be a prop. Finally, on April the 29th, 1888, Stanley found Emin Pasha. And the meeting should have been the climax, the moment that justifies the cost. Instead, it was a humiliation. The forward column arrived not as saviors, but as starving dependents. The original plan had been to bring supplies to a stranded governor. But by the time they reached him, They were the ones who needed feeding. Emin had to support Stanley's men. That reversal is the second psychological trick of imperial storytelling. It can survive almost any contradiction as long as it never admits the contradiction out loud. There's a detail that feels like comedy until you realize what it reveals. The expedition had carried 3 bottles of champagne across this nightmare, saving them for the celebration when they finally found Emin. Think about what that means. In the middle of disease and death, the expedition protected luxury like it was sacred. Not because champagne mattered, but because ritual mattered. The bottles were proof that the story would still have a civilized ending. A toast, a photograph in the mind, the illusion of control. But then Emin refused to play his part. He didn't want to leave. In the European imagination, Emin was a trapped man. In reality, he was a governor with his own power, his own army, his own capital, his own sense of calculation. He believed he could hold out. He believed communication lines might be restored. He believed the political storm could pass. To Stanley, after a year of sickness and constant threat, that sounded like madness. To Emin, leaving could look like surrender, abandoning a domain he'd governed into someone else's hands. And that's where the hidden motive of the expedition begins to glow through the surface. Because if Egypt no longer wanted Equatoria, someone else might. The expedition had moved through Leopold's Congo for a reason. It had been financed and routed through networks of ownership. Rescue was the language. Territory was the subtext. So when Emin refused to leave, the mission's official purpose fractured. And when a mission fractures, the machine doesn't stop. It looks for a new justification. Stanley didn't have the resources to simply turn around and march back the way he came. The forward column was too depleted. It had started with 389 men. When it reached Emin, only 169 remained. That number is not just a statistic. It's a moral measurement. It's the price of a story. So Stanley did what failing systems always do. He doubled down. He spent nearly another year trying to gather resources, negotiate, recruit, and stabilize enough force to move again. The expedition became trapped in limbo, neither rescue nor retreat, neither victory nor admission of defeat. A mission that cannot finish becomes dangerous because it starts feeding on anything it can reach. In April 1889, Stanley finally forced the decision. He told Emin he was leaving on April the 10th, with or without him. The rescue became an ultimatum. The humanitarian mask slipped just enough to reveal the steel beneath. Obey the plan or be abandoned. Emin came. And now the expedition had a new problem: getting back out alive. As they began the long retreat, the story split wider. The front column was moving again, ragged, compromised, carrying a rescued man who had resisted rescue. Meanwhile, somewhere behind them, the rear column had been sitting in rot and fear for months, unsupervised, starving, and sliding toward its own private law. And here's the question that should bother you. What happens to a group of armed men when the official purpose is gone, but the weapons, the hunger, and the entitlement remain? In the next part, we leave the front's uneasy retreat and descend into the place where the expedition's worst secrets were made. The rear column, where discipline becomes terror, where silence becomes policy. and where the first truly unforgivable transaction is about to be priced. The rear column was the part of the expedition designed to be invisible. Not in the plan. On the map it mattered. In the story, it didn't. It was supposed to be a warehouse with legs. Hold supplies, wait for porters, feed the spearhead. But the moment Stanley vanished into the interior, the rear column became something far more dangerous than a supply depot. It became a pocket of power without supervision. The entire system depended on one assumption: that Tipu Tip would provide a chain of couriers to carry goods forward. Couriers, that's the polite word. In practice, it meant coerced bodies, bought or seized, marched along routes already stained by slave networks. The expedition treated this as logistics. The people living there experienced it as the return of an old horror wearing a new uniform. Then the assumption failed. The misunderstanding was lethal in its banality. Tipu Tip's network didn't move for speeches. It moved for ammunition, for leverage, for profit. And the kind of traders he dealt with were not interested in promises, only payment that could win fights. But Stanley's forward column had carried much of the ammunition away with it. So Tipu Tip, faced with a deal that no longer benefited him, drifted back into his own business. The rear column was left with the worst possible combination: responsibility without resources, authority without supply, and distance without communication. That is how a humanitarian mission becomes a hostage situation. Only the hostages are the men who thought they were the rescuers. At first, the rear column tried to do it properly. They waited. They rationed. They expected local trade to fill the gaps. But the locals didn't want to trade. Not with a camp associated with Tipu Tip's name. Not with strangers who carried guns and spoke in demands. Trust is a currency too. The expedition arrived bankrupt, so hunger became the new commander. When food doesn't arrive, morality becomes negotiable. The rear column began to secure provisions. And that phrase starts to mean what it always means in failing empires: coercion. People were seized from nearby villages and held to force trade, ransom dressed up as necessity. It's important to understand the psychological move here. Nobody in the camp would say, "We are becoming criminals." They would say, "We are maintaining the expedition." The mission becomes a moral shield you can commit violence behind. This is the moment betrayal stops being personal and becomes structural. Disease joined hunger the way night joins day. Fevers thinned the camp. Infections spread. Men deserted. Some fled because they were afraid. Some fled because they were starving. Some fled because they could see where this was going. Toward a place where discipline becomes cruelty and cruelty becomes habit. And every desertion intensified paranoia. If men keep leaving, the officers tighten control. If officers tighten control, more men leave. Collapse feeds itself. Over this, Major Edmund Bartolo tried to impose order. The kind of order that looks clean in a report, but feels like terror inside a camp. He was a soldier trained to believe discipline prevents disaster. But discipline without legitimacy is just violence with rules. Reports that later emerged described escalating punishments, public floggings, humiliations, an obsession with control that only worsened the breakdown. Whether every extreme detail in later accusations is exact or embellished, the direction of travel is consistent. The rear column's civilization didn't soften under stress. It hardened into brutality. And the most damning part is how ordinary this is in the logic of power. A private expedition has no court-martial that matters out here. No bureaucracy that can intervene in time. No public oversight. The men in the camp know they are alone. That knowledge distorts everything. Every conflict becomes existential. Every disagreement becomes treason. Every failure needs a scapegoat. Bartolo begins to suspect his own officers. Officers begin to resent Bartolo. The camp becomes a political arena, small, sweaty, diseased, where authority is contested not with debates, but with fear. It's the micro version of empire itself, a hierarchy that only works when supplies flow and the myth of purpose holds. Remove supplies and purpose, and you see what's underneath. James S. Jameson was in this rear column too, wealthy, educated, a scientific man surrounded by hunger and weapons. He is often introduced as the civilized observer, the gentleman naturalist. But that identity depends on the presence of safety. In a collapsing camp, observer becomes participant, whether you admit it or not. Because you eat what the camp eats. You rely on the camp's coercion. You benefit from the camp's violence, even if you never lift a hand. Complicity doesn't ask if you enjoyed it. It asks if you stayed. And as the rear column decayed, a second betrayal took shape. The betrayal of truth. The expedition's future depended on how this story would be told back in Europe. If the rear column's crimes were spoken plainly, the mission's moral mask would tear. So even before anyone returned home, the incentives for concealment were already in place. Officers wrote selectively. Men remembered selectively. And later, when questions came from journalists, the easiest move would be to make the horror look like a few bad individuals rather than a system that produced them. But we're not there yet. In the jungle, the rear column was still searching for a lifeline. Jameson tried to re-establish contact with Tipu Tip. He went looking for the man whose network had been sold to them as salvation. He negotiated, begged, attempted to buy movement, because movement was the only thing that could save the expedition from becoming a prison camp in the forest. And it is on one of these attempts, moving toward Tipu Tip's dealings near Riba Riba, that the next catastrophe begins to form, not from hunger, not from disease, but from something more revealing, curiosity, the kind of curiosity that thinks human suffering is a spectacle, the kind that hears a rumor, cannibalism, and treats it like a test, a dare, a story to own. In the next part, we follow Jameson into the moment where the rear column's moral collapse becomes a transaction with a price tag, 6 handkerchiefs. And we ask the question that power always tries to dodge. When you pay for horror, are you a witness or an author? Every disaster has a supply chain. And the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition didn't drift into horror by accident. It moved along routes that were already engineered to turn human beings into transport, payment, and profit. Tipu Tip wasn't a quirky local contact Stanley picked up for convenience. He was a node in a much older machine, the East African Central African trading world, that linked interior communities to the Swahili coast, to Zanzibar, to the Indian Ocean, and, through European demand, to global markets. His wealth wasn't built on exploration in the romantic sense. It was built on control of routes, stations, armed men, and coerced labor. Ivory moved. People moved with it. Sometimes as porters, sometimes as captives, often as both, because the line between hired and forced dissolves fast when a gun is part of the negotiation. This is the part that European narratives loved to blur. They spoke of caravans, porters, couriers, service. Those words are clean. They sound voluntary, but in the interior, motion had a price, and the price was frequently paid by the bodies that carried the load. When Stanley's expedition leaned on Tipu Tip, it wasn't just partnering with a man. It was plugging into an existing coercive infrastructure and calling it logistics. And here's the betrayal that sits under everything. The expedition's moral story depended on pretending those systems didn't exist until it needed them. It's easy to imagine imperial violence as spontaneous cruelty. A man loses his temper, a camp goes mad, a tragedy happens. That's comforting because it implies the system was fine until individuals broke. The truth is uglier and more bureaucratic. Violence was planned into the math. Think about what the expedition required. Hundreds of men, tons of equipment, boats that could be taken apart and carried, ammunition, food, medical supplies. You cannot move that through the Congo with speeches. You move it by securing labor that must be fed, controlled, punished, replaced. And when feeding labor fails, coercion becomes the default setting. Not because everyone is uniquely evil, but because the machine has momentum. It must keep moving or it dies. And if it dies, reputations die with it. That's why Tipu Tip mattered so much. He represented a shortcut through the problem of labor. He had people, he had networks, he had fear. From a purely logistical view, he was efficient. From a moral view, he was a confession. The expedition could not be civilizing the Congo while subcontracting movement to a man whose power was inseparable from enslavement and raiding. But that contradiction only matters if you admit contradictions. Empire survives by refusing to admit them. And so the expedition did what power always does when it needs both innocence and results. It split the blame in advance. When Stanley wrote of couriers, he didn't have to say slaves. When committees spoke of rescue, they didn't have to say trade. When donors pictured saving Emin, they didn't have to picture what it takes to drag steel and ammunition across a continent, the broken feet, the starvation, the silent graves. This is the philosophy of modern conquest. Keep the suffering off stage and the audience will pay for the show. Now, layer Leopold's Congo over this. Congo Free State was not simply a geographic space. It was an extraction project with a legal costume. Stations along the river weren't built as humanitarian outposts. They were built as nodes, places to store, count, and push resources outward. Ivory was the early obsession. Dense value you can carry far. And ivory doesn't appear by magic. It comes from hunting and violence and the control of territory. Control requires armed force. Armed force requires supplies. Supplies require labor. Labor requires coercion. The chain is not complicated. It's just hidden. So when Stanley chose to run this expedition through Leopold's territory, it wasn't merely a route. It was alignment with an economic regime where human life was already being translated into output. The expedition didn't invent that regime, but it operated inside it, and it benefited from it, which means it inherited its moral corrosion. And that corrosion spreads in predictable ways. Once Tipu Tip withdrew, the rear column did not suddenly become virtuous because the slave trader left. It became desperate. And desperation in a coercive system doesn't create ethics, it creates improvisation. If they can't buy food, they seize people as leverage. If they can't secure carriers, they pressure villages. If they can't keep men from deserting, they escalate punishment. This is how order turns into terror, without anyone needing to announce, "We are now evil." The machine does it quietly. It also explains why the rear column's crimes were later so difficult to narrate honestly. If Stanley admits the rear column relied on coercive labor and ransom-like seizures to survive, then the expedition ceases to be a rescue and becomes what it always partly was, an armed venture operating in a market of bodies. That isn't just scandalous, it threatens the entire moral justification for European presence in the region. So the story must be simplified. 2 men go mad, a few bad apples, tragedy, end of file. But systems don't like being reduced to villains. They prefer to vanish into procedure. That's why, when the Jameson affair erupts, the argument will not just be about what happened to a child. It will be about what kind of machine could make that moment possible, where a human life can be priced in cloth, delivered like merchandise, and then debated in newspapers, as if the central question is whether a gentleman's reputation suffered. Because the expedition had already taught everyone its core lesson. In the Empire's ledger, the most valuable commodity isn't ivory, it's plausible deniability. In the next part, we arrive at Ribba Ribba and watch the moral math become literal. A bargain, a dare, 6 handkerchiefs, and a death that will later be argued over like a legal technicality. And you'll have to decide what's more terrifying, Jameson's claimed ignorance or the system that made ignorance a usable excuse. There are crimes that happen in secrecy, and then there are crimes that happen in daylight, because the perpetrator believes daylight belongs to him. The Jameson affair lives in that second category. Not because it's the only atrocity connected to the expedition, but because it exposes the psychology of empire in its purest form. A human life reduced to a demonstration, a rumor turned into a transaction, and then, when the bill comes due, an entire social class mobilizing to argue that the transaction didn't really mean what it plainly meant. The setting is Ribba Ribba, a trading zone in the interior where Tipu Tip's influence and local power intersected. Exactly the kind of place where commodities moved and people moved with them. James S. Jameson was there, trying to do what the rear column could no longer do. Buy movement, buy a supply line, buy time. The camp was starving. Authority was fraying. Men were deserting. Disease was chewing through bodies like rot through wood. In that atmosphere, every decision carries the pressure of collapse. And this is where the story turns from logistical tragedy into moral catastrophe. Jameson hears talk of cannibalism, stories about terrible cannibals, about bodies vanishing after battles, about meat being washed in a well until fat slicked the water. In his own diary, he records this talk. He frames himself as skeptical, as if disbelief could protect him from responsibility. Then comes the line that should ring like a verdict. Someone says, essentially, "Give me cloth and you'll see." Jameson gives it 6 handkerchiefs. Not because he is forced, not because a gun is at his head, not because he has no choice. He gives it under the posture of curiosity, under the mask of a joke, under the cultivated Victorian habit of treating the world as something to observe rather than something you are obligated to protect. That habit is lethal in the Congo. Because observation becomes participation the moment money changes hands. In the version that later circulates through witnesses, the scene is even more explicit. A child is brought, tied, killed, cut up. Jameson sketches as it happens. In the version Jameson writes himself, he tries to keep his hands clean with a slight shift of emphasis. He claims he didn't believe they were serious until the last moment. He claims he thought it was a ruse to extract a gift. He describes the killing as shockingly swift, the child silent, the body rapidly dismantled, the pieces taken to the river to wash. But notice what never changes between versions. The exchange. He paid. The child arrived. The child died. The technical argument, did he order it or merely enable it, belongs to lawyers and people who want to preserve reputations. In the moral world, the distinction is thinner than paper. If you fund an act knowing the act is possible, if you hand over the price after hearing the terms, you don't get to retreat behind innocence when the terms are fulfilled. That is the logic Jameson tries to outrun with his phrasing. Until the last moment, I could not believe. This is not a defense. It is a portrait of complicity. Because disbelief here isn't ignorance, it's convenience. It's the same mental maneuver that lets empires exist. We didn't know, we couldn't have known, we only meant well. The body on the ground becomes unfortunate evidence that reality refused to cooperate with the story. And this is why the 6 handkerchiefs matter. They are not just a payment, they are a ritual object, a symbolic conversion of a human being into a purchase. They make the killing legible in the Empire's preferred language, transaction. Once something becomes a transaction, it can be debated like a contract dispute. It can be edited. It can be litigated in print. It can be reframed as misunderstanding. Even the act of sketching, whether done in the moment or later, functions as a second conversion. It turns death into documentation. It turns a child into evidence of the explorer's access to the exotic. And that is what scientific curiosity can become inside colonial power, a way of consuming the world without being consumed by guilt. A way of saying, I saw it, therefore it belongs to my record. But here is the darkest layer. Jameson was not acting alone in a vacuum. He was acting inside a camp already structured to treat people as means. The rear column had kidnapped locals for leverage. It had used coercion to survive. It had partnered, directly or indirectly, with slave networks. It had already accepted day by day that other lives could be spent to keep the expedition moving. In that sense, Jameson's act is not an aberration. It is the expedition's logic made visible. And when you see it that way, the real horror isn't just that one man paid for one death. It's that the system produced a man who could plausibly write it down afterward and still imagine himself civilized. Jameson's diary preserves the moment with unsettling calm. But the calm doesn't prove innocence. It proves what the Congo did to the Victorian mind when it removed the audience. It revealed how quickly morality becomes optional when the world is treated as a stage and human beings are treated as props. The girl is nameless in the record, not because she lacked a name, but because the Empire didn't need it. The expedition's ledger didn't have a column for her identity. It had a column for supplies, for cloth, for ammunition, for miles marched. And that absence, her erasure, is the second death that follows the first. In the next part, we move from the act itself to what power does next, almost automatically: concealment. Stanley will return to Europe and publish Triumph. The rear column's rot will be censored. The Jameson affair will surface only through leaks and affidavits. And the question won't be who killed a child, the question will be, can we keep the story clean? Because for Empire, the greatest emergency is never the crime, it's the scandal. Empires don't fall apart when they commit crimes. They fall apart when the crimes become legible. That's why the next phase of this story is not the jungle. It's the editing room. It's the letter. It's the careful omission. Because once the expedition started eating itself, morally and physically, the most important supply line wasn't food, it was narrative. When Stanley finally brought the battered remains of the expedition back toward the coast, he was carrying more than survivors. He was carrying a story that had to be sold, not as chaos, not as a private venture that partnered with slave networks and drifted into kidnappings and madness. It had to be sold as heroism, and heroism requires clean lines, noble purpose, unfortunate hardship, victorious conclusion. The rear column destroyed that structure. The rear column turned the expedition from a rescue into a scandal factory. Hunger produced coercion. Authority produced abuse. Curiosity produced a death priced in cloth. And all of it produced the single thing a 19th century imperial public could not comfortably consume: the possibility that civilization was not rescuing Africa, but revealing its own appetite. Stanley understood this instinctively. He didn't need a memo from a committee. He didn't need a lecture in public relations. He knew that to protect his reputation and the legitimacy of the entire enterprise, he had to practice the oldest technique of power, selective truth. So when he published his account, he performed a kind of bureaucratic magic. Names remained, suffering remained, but the moral core was blurred. Key facts were softened or left out. The rear column became a vague tragedy rather than a documented collapse of discipline into brutality. Jameson's death became illness. Bartolow's death became a simple shot. The expedition stayed narratively heroic because the ugliest parts were not allowed to contaminate the page. This is how conquest sanitizes itself, not by lying in every sentence, but by deciding which sentences never get written. Stanley later admitted, under pressure, that he had censored the rear column. That confession matters more than any single detail because it reveals the priority. Protect the image first, handle the truth later, if ever. And notice the logic that makes censorship feel virtuous. He frames it as compassion, protecting dead men's reputations, sparing families, avoiding sensationalism. But compassion here is also concealment, and concealment is also policy. Because once you accept the idea that the public cannot handle the truth, you have granted yourself the right to shape reality. You become not only a witness, but an editor of the moral record. You decide what counts as history and what becomes rumor. And that power, the power to define what happened, is almost more consequential than the original crime. A murder kills a person. A cover-up kills accountability. The rear column's survivors were a threat to that controlled narrative. Men like William Bonney, people who had seen the sketches, heard the talk, witnessed the decay, carried dangerous information back with them. But survivors are not automatically truth machines. They are also men with interests, self-preservation, reputation, career. They know what kind of scandal can ruin them. They also know what kind of scandal can be pinned on dead men who can't speak. This is where the story becomes a moral courtroom with missing defendants. Bartolo is dead. Jameson is dead. The expedition can't bring them to the stand. So the argument becomes a fight over testimony and credibility. Who said what? Who heard what? Who is reliable? Who is motivated by revenge? Who is bribed? Who is coerced? It becomes the kind of debate the public loves because it creates uncertainty. Because uncertainty allows people to choose the version that preserves their comfort. And the people most motivated to preserve comfort are the ones who profit from the system. Jameson's widow becomes a central figure in this phase, not because she orchestrated the original act, but because she represents the defensive reflex of class. A gentleman naturalist cannot be allowed to become a butcher in the public imagination, not because the public loves Jameson personally, but because the public needs what he symbolizes. The idea that the educated European is inherently moral, even when placed inside an immoral structure. So, the defense strategy forms. He was tricked. He didn't know. He was skeptical. He was horrified. He had no tools to sketch in the moment. The sketches were made later. The interpreter was untrustworthy. The testimony was coerced. The story was exaggerated. Notice how the defense doesn't need to deny that a child died. It only needs to deny that the child's death reflects who Jameson really was. That's the trick. Detach the act from the identity. Make evil an accident that happened near him rather than through him. And Stanley, for his part, tries to manage blame the way institutions always do, by isolating it. He emphasizes Bartolo's madness. He portrays the rear column as an exceptional breakdown. He suggests that other officers could have stopped it if they had been firmer. In that framing, the expedition remains basically noble, but tragically undermined by a few weak links. This is not just self-protection. It is ideological protection. If the horror is systemic, then the entire European project in Africa becomes suspect. If the horror is individual, then the system remains untouched. So the rear column becomes a sacrifice in the court of public opinion. Let the dead carry the weight. Let the living walk free. Let the machine keep running. But machines have one vulnerability: documents. Because a private expedition can censor its official narrative, but it can't fully control what was written in diaries, what was said in camp, what was sworn in affidavits, what was remembered by men who survived. And in Jameson's case, the most dangerous witness is not an angry interpreter or a rival officer. It is Jameson himself. His diary, written without the expectation of a public trial, written in the voice of a man recording what he saw, contains the unerasable spine of the event, the challenge, the payment, the child, the killing. It can be framed, it can be softened, but it cannot be made clean. That is why the silence could not hold forever. In the next part, the conspiracy breaks. Journalists press, Stanley speaks, affidavits surface, newspapers become battlegrounds, and the world will watch a Victorian society do what societies always do when confronted with evidence that threatens its self-image. It will argue not over the dead child, but over which version of reality it is allowed to believe. Silence doesn't break like glass. It breaks like a dam. One leak, then a second, then the sudden realization that the wall was always made of paper, For nearly 2 years after the expedition's worst moments, the public story stayed clean enough to sell. Stanley returned with the aura of survival. He published, he lectured, he let the world applaud the idea of rescue. The dead were filed away as misfortune. The rear column was treated like an unfortunate footnote. Jameson, wealthy, well-connected, and conveniently deceased, could remain a romantic figure, a naturalist struck down by fever while pursuing knowledge. But there is a problem with censorship. It doesn't erase what happened. It only changes where the truth lives. The truth moved into whispers, into private letters, into survivor conversations, into the memory of the people who had watched a camp dissolve into cruelty. It moved into the kind of rumors that travel faster than official reports, because rumors don't require permission. And eventually, those rumors reached the one institution that loves contradiction more than empires do: the press. Journalists began asking what really happened to the rear column, not because they cared about African lives. Victorian compassion was selective, but because they cared about scandal, about the gap between the heroic narrative and the suspicious silence around it. When people die in imperial ventures, society can tolerate it if the deaths are noble. What it cannot tolerate, at least not openly, is the suspicion that the deaths were pointless, ugly, and morally indicting. Stanley resisted for a long time, but pressure is a kind of hunger too. Eventually, he did what powerful men do when they sense the narrative slipping away. He spoke first, so he could shape the terms of what would come out. In November 1890, a major statement of his was published in the Times. The phrasing is revealing, not just what he says, but how he says it. He repeats accusations in the cautious grammar of distance. I was told. It's a legal posture. It allows him to reveal horror while still keeping his own hands technically clean. He describes the rear column's disorder. He describes Barthelot's brutal conduct. He frames his earlier silence as censorship, done for reasons that sound almost paternal, protecting reputations, preventing disgrace. The subtext is simple. He is admitting there is rot, but insisting the rot is containable. Then comes the sentence that detonates the story, the accusation that Jameson stood by while a young girl, purchased for the purpose, was killed so he could witness cannibalism and record it. This is the moment Victorian society does something predictable. It turns away from the victim and stares at the stain on the gentleman's name. The newspapers treated it as a crisis of credibility. They emphasized the fact that both Barthelot and Jameson were dead, and therefore could not answer. They debated whether Stanley was protecting himself by sacrificing men who could not defend their reputations. They questioned whether the evidence was reliable. They pointed out that much of Stanley's account was second-hand. This sounds like skepticism, like reason, but it's also a psychological defense mechanism. If you can turn the story into a courtroom fight over testimony, you don't have to feel the moral weight of the act itself. Within days, the controversy expanded. Affidavit-like statements and reports circulated, most famously attributed to Jameson's interpreter, describing the purchase, the child, the killing, and the sketches. Other survivors were said to have seen the drawings and heard Jameson speak about the scene. Whether every detail was perfectly recalled is not the central point. The central point is that multiple streams of testimony converged on the same spine. There was an exchange of cloth. There was a child. There was a death. And Jameson was entangled. And then the counterattack came. Jameson's widow fought like someone trying to hold back history with her bare hands. She emphasized Jameson's character. She attacked the credibility of the interpreter. She offered a competing story, that Jameson was skeptical, that he thought it was a trick, that the killing happened too quickly for sketches, that the sketches, if they existed, were made later, and that Jameson was horrified. In other words, yes, something terrible happened, but it doesn't mean what you think it means. This is where the mechanics of cover-up become visible in their most human form. It isn't always a smoky room with conspirators. Sometimes it's a widow, with a social world collapsing around her, using the only weapons she has: reputation, class assumptions, and the public's desire to believe that a civilized man cannot be the author of barbarism. And the public wanted that belief. Because if a gentleman naturalist can fund a child's death for curiosity, then the line between civilization and savagery collapses. And if that line collapses, the entire imperial story collapses with it. The empire is not just extracting resources, it is extracting moral superiority. It needs the myth that it is different, cleaner, better. So the argument becomes obsessive. Did he mean it? Did he know? Did he order it? Was he tricked? Was the interpreter lying? Was Stanley biased? Were the sketches real? And while everyone argues, the most important fact becomes background noise. A child was killed, and the people debating it are treating her like a footnote in a reputational dispute. That is the catastrophe of exposure. Not only that the horror is revealed, but that the reveal is immediately converted into a social game. Truth reduced to a weapon. Morality reduced to optics. And then, like all scandals, it metastasizes. Some accounts claim recantations. Others claim coercion. The details become muddy because the incentives are muddy. If you were a survivor, you might fear legal consequences or social ruin. If you were connected to Jameson's circle, you might push for denial. If you were Stanley, you might reveal enough to seem honest, but not enough to indict the larger machine. Everyone has a reason to shape the narrative, but one witness is harder to bully than any interpreter or newspaper editor. Jameson's diary exists. It doesn't read like a man boasting. It reads like a man trying to frame himself as skeptical, as surprised, as unwilling, yet still recording the exchange that made the act possible. The dare, the cloth, the child, the knife. The diary doesn't allow the public the comfort of total denial. It forces them into the more difficult space: partial guilt, plausible excuses, moral contamination. And here is the cruelest twist. Even with a diary, even with affidavits, even with multiple testimonies, the scandal still offers society an escape hatch, because the central accused is dead. Dead men don't sue. Dead men don't testify. Dead men become symbols you can arrange however you like. In the next part, we follow what happens when an expedition's truth is finally visible. But accountability is impossible. Bartolo is already in the ground. Jameson is already gone. Stanley is already celebrated. And the system that made the horror possible is still standing, still profitable, still hungry. Because the final betrayal of empire is this: it survives its own scandals by outliving its witnesses. If the Congo teaches one lesson with brutal clarity, it is this: power doesn't need to be innocent. It only needs to be unpunishable. By the time the scandal broke in newspapers, the two men at the center of the rear column's horror were already beyond reach. Bartolo was dead. Jameson was dead. Their bodies had done what empires dream of doing to evidence: remove it from the courtroom. And that is why the story becomes so slippery. Not because the truth disappeared, but because the living no longer had a clean path to consequences. Bartolo's end, even in its simplest form, reads like the moral logic of a system snapping shut. Accounts describe him confronting local drumming and singing at dawn, trying to impose his authority over people whose lives he had already treated as expendable. He is said to have struck or prodded a woman, escalating a conflict that never needed to exist except for one man's obsession with domination. Her husband shoots him. The camp executes the husband days later. The pattern is familiar. The powerful man creates violence, the powerless man retaliates, and the system kills the retaliator to restore order. Even the death that looks like justice is absorbed into the machinery. And what does Europe do with Bartolo's death? It metabolizes it. In the public narrative, his death becomes tragedy, an unfortunate loss. In the private narrative, it becomes proof that he lost control. It becomes convenient because it allows the expedition to isolate rot in one man. Madness, temper, misconduct, a personal failure. Anything but the larger truth, that the rear column was a pressure cooker built by the expedition's structure. Abandonment, scarcity, coercion, and the absence of oversight. A system that would have punished someone eventually, because it was designed to generate punishable behavior. Jameson's death is quieter, and that quietness is its own kind of violence. He dies of fever in August 1888. No duel, no dramatic confession, just illness. The Empire's favorite alibi, because it sounds natural, unavoidable, morally neutral. Fever turns a man into a victim, and victims attract sympathy. His final reported words, fragmented, fearful, hearing "they're coming," can be read as delirium. They can also be read as the mind's last attempt to give shape to guilt. But either way, death performs the same function. It ends interrogation. The witnesses vanish. The ledger remains. And Stanley returns to Europe with something even more valuable than survival: control over the main story. He publishes In Darkest Africa and becomes, briefly, a hero again. This is where the philosophy of power becomes stark. A narrative can be triumphant even when the facts are grotesque, because most audiences don't demand moral coherence. They demand emotional coherence. They want suffering to produce meaning. They want to believe the dead bought something: knowledge, progress, salvation. If they are forced to see that the dead bought only profit and prestige for others, the entire moral economy collapses. So, the expedition is marketed as endurance, as bravery, as proof of European resolve. But the rear column's truth refuses to stay buried, and when it surfaces, Stanley's heroism becomes something else, an exercise in selective disclosure. He admits enough to appear honest. He frames the worst as second-hand. He claims censorship was done for reputational mercy. He points toward individual misconduct. He keeps the machine itself out of the indictment. That is the art of institutional survival. Sacrifice the parts, preserve the whole. And the whole was larger than the expedition. The whole was the Congo project itself, an extraction regime that could not afford public moral collapse. Because at the same time Europeans were debating whether Jameson meant to pay for cannibalism, Leopold's system was deepening its grip on labour and resources. The public's outrage, where it existed, was often channeled into the safest direction, condemning barbaric customs or mad officers, rather than confronting the most dangerous idea of all, that European presence was structurally entangled with coercion. This is where the scandal becomes an ideological quarantine. The Victorian mind needed an explanation that didn't threaten its identity. So it reached for the most convenient one. The wilderness corrupts men. Africa turns Europeans into monsters. The jungle produces madness. That explanation is seductive because it moves guilt away from policy and onto environment. It suggests the system was noble, but the setting was poisonous. But listen carefully. That is exactly what empire wants you to believe. Because if Africa is the corrupter, then Europe remains the moral center. Europe can continue to rule for the good of the natives, while privately extracting everything it wants, blaming every atrocity on the darkness of the land rather than the logic of control. The wilderness becomes a scapegoat. The machine remains righteous. And yet, the most unsettling evidence undermines that comfort. Jameson's own writing doesn't show a man possessed by jungle madness. It shows a man operating within a transactional mindset, a dare, a payment, a spectacle. That's not supernatural corruption. That's modernity. Human life turned into an experiment, an anecdote, a collectible experience. Which means the expedition didn't reveal Africa's darkness. It revealed the empires. By the end of 1890, the controversy had done lasting damage. It embarrassed the expedition's organizers. It weakened Stanley's moral halo. It showed the public a crack in the humanitarian facade. But embarrassment is not justice. Damage to reputation is not accountability. And the core mechanism that produced the catastrophe, private power operating under moral branding, did not vanish. It evolved. Because the colonial world learned something from this scandal too. If you want to keep doing what you're doing, you must manage the story more carefully. You must control the channels. You must bury the inconvenient documents. You must convert bodies into numbers and numbers into necessity. And that is why the story doesn't end with the deaths of Bartolo and Jameson. Their deaths are not closure. They are the condition that makes denial possible. In the next part, we step back and ask why this affair still echoes, and why so many readers see its shadow in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Not because Conrad gives you a perfect documentary record, but because he captures the psychological truth that history keeps repeating. Empires don't collapse when they do evil. They collapse when someone forces them to look at themselves. When people say Heart of Darkness is about Africa, they're repeating the oldest imperial misdirection in the book. It's not about Africa. Africa is the stage. The real subject is what happens to power when it stops needing to explain itself. What happens to the European mind when law becomes distant, oversight becomes optional, and profit becomes the only god left in the room. That is why the Jameson affair clings to Conrad's novel like a shadow. Not because you can prove a single one-to-one inspiration for Kurtz in a courtroom sense, but because the scandal and the fiction share the same anatomy. A moral mission that turns into extraction. A civilized man who becomes a symbol of corruption, and a system that survives by insisting the corruption is personal, not structural. Look at the way Victorian society reacted to the rear column. The argument was never primarily about the girl. It was about whether a gentleman could be guilty without ceasing to be a gentleman. The debate turned on credibility, on class, on motives, on technicalities. It demanded an explanation that preserved the central myth, that Europeans bring order, science, and ethics, even when individual men misbehave. Conrad exposes the lie beneath that myth. In Heart of Darkness, Kurtz is the Empire's dream product, talented, articulate, idealistic, capable of turning violence into eloquence. He is sent into the interior under the language of uplift, and he becomes, depending on which reading you choose, either a madman corrupted by wilderness or the logical endpoint of extraction. The first reading comforts the Empire. Africa did it. The second indicts the Empire. The system did it. The Jameson affair presses the same choice on real history. If you want comfort, you say Jameson was tricked. He was naive. He couldn't have known. He was caught in a moment of chaos. Or you say Bartolo went mad, an exceptional breakdown under stress. You say this was a freak accident, a grotesque aberration in an otherwise noble mission. But the documentary spine of the story resists that comfort. The expedition partnered with coercive networks, depended on forced labor disguised as couriers, resorted to kidnapping for supplies, and then tried to censor what that reality looked like. That is not an aberration. That is a system operating under pressure exactly as it was designed to operate, prioritizing the mission's continuity over other lives. Kurtz's real horror is not that he is a monster. It's that he is not a monster in any supernatural sense. He is a man whose environment finally matches his incentives. He is what happens when rhetoric and profit align, when moral language becomes a tool rather than a restraint. That's why his famous last words land like a verdict, not a confession. They sound like a man seeing, too late, the full shape of the machine he served. Now bring that lens back to Stanley, Jameson, and the rear column. Stanley isn't Kurtz, but he plays a related role. He is the great narrator of the imperial frontier. He knows how to turn suffering into meaning and meaning into legitimacy. His censorship of the rear column is not just personal cowardice, it's institutional competence. He is managing the image of the Enterprise so that the Enterprise can continue. He is, in other words, doing what empires actually pay people to do. Translate violence into acceptable language. Jameson isn't Kurtz either, but he represents a different imperial archetype, the scientific consumer, the man who believes observation is innocence, the man who can write about atrocities in the calm voice of documentation, as if naming a thing is the same as confronting it. The man who treats human suffering as evidence of cultural difference, rather than as a moral emergency requiring intervention. And Bartolo, whether every detail of later accounts is exact or not, represents the frontline truth of domination. When you are trapped, hungry, and afraid, authority becomes addictive. The colonial officer learns that fear works. He uses it. Then he needs more of it. Then the camp becomes a miniature state, whose only law is the mood of the man holding power. All three are not random villains, they are functions. This is the philosophical pivot Conrad forces, and history confirms. Empire does not depend on monsters. It depends on ordinary men performing roles in a structure that rewards brutality and punishes restraint. The deeper you go into the interior, whether the literal interior of the Congo, or the metaphorical interior of unchecked authority, the more the system peels away the polite constraints and reveals its operational truth. So why did Victorian society cling so hard to the mad individual explanation? Because systemic guilt is too expensive. If Jameson is merely a wicked gentleman, society can condemn him and move on. If Bartolo is merely insane, society can mourn and move on. If Stanley made a few unfortunate decisions, society can debate and move on. The machine remains intact. But if the machine itself is guilty, if the expedition was always a hybrid of rescue and profit, if the Congo project was always a legal costume for extraction, then the moral identity of an entire civilization becomes suspect. And that is a cost most societies will pay any price to avoid, even the price of forgetting the dead. Which is why the girl at the center of the Jameson affair remains unnamed in the popular story. The Empire does not need her name. A name would make her real. A real person would make the transaction as unforgivable. Better to keep her as an abstraction, a symbol, a rumor, a scandal. But Conrad's genius is that he does not let you escape into abstraction. He makes you sit with the emotional truth that behind the rhetoric, behind the mission, behind the civilizing language, there is an appetite. And appetite does not argue, it consumes. In the final part, we return to the big question and close the ledger. Not by pretending we can deliver perfect justice across time, but by naming the mechanism that produced the catastrophe. The transformation of human life into a cost, and the transformation of silence into a tool. Because if you understand that mechanism, you stop asking whether this was an isolated horror. You start asking how many other horrors were priced the same way, and never made it to the newspaper. 6 handkerchiefs, a small, almost ridiculous number. Soft cloth in a world of iron. And yet, it sits at the center of this entire catastrophe, because it tells you what empire really is when you strip away the speeches. A system that learns to convert life into an itemized cost, then convert that cost into silence. Now we can finally answer the big question we opened with. How did a mission sold as rescue, clean, scientific, civilized, become a machine that devoured people, then tried to bury the teeth marks in paperwork and denial? It happened the way these transformations always happen, not through one sudden moral collapse, but through a sequence of rational choices made inside an immoral structure. First, power rewrote the environment into a ledger. The Congo became free by legal fiction. Exploration became humanitarian by committee language. Private interest became public good by international recognition. Once that translation is complete, violence doesn't need to hide. It only needs to justify itself as necessity, security, progress, order, commerce. Second, the expedition imported a system of coercion and called it logistics. You cannot move hundreds of men and tons of equipment through Central Africa without labor. Labor was obtained and organized through networks that already treated human beings as transportable property. Tipu Tip wasn't a footnote. He was a signpost. The moment the expedition embraced him, it embraced the underlying rule of the region's economy. Bodies move goods, and bodies are also goods. Third, scarcity turned entitlement into action. When trade dried up, the rear column didn't stop to reconsider its legitimacy. It escalated. It kidnapped for leverage. It coerced for food. It punished to prevent desertion. Every step felt necessary to survive, And that is the most dangerous word in the vocabulary of power. Necessity is how cruelty becomes mundane. Necessity is how a man convinces himself he is still civilized while doing uncivilized things. Fourth, authority became addiction. Bartolot's rear column is the microstate version of empire. Discipline without oversight, command without accountability, punishment as policy. Whether every later accusation about his behavior is perfectly precise is almost beside the point. The structure was designed to produce brutality because it removed the restraints that make brutality costly. Once you are isolated, armed, starving, and afraid, the easiest way to create order is terror. The camp did not drift into that by accident. It drifted into it because terror is efficient. And then the sixth handkerchiefs arrive, the moment the moral logic becomes literal. Jameson's act, however you frame his intention, demonstrates the core psychological maneuver of imperial civilization, the ability to treat human suffering as spectacle while preserving the self-image of innocence. He records himself as skeptical, as surprised, as unwilling until the last moment. But the payment happens. The child appears. The killing happens. The transaction is fulfilled. And the record survives. This is not merely one man's depravity. It is what happens when curiosity is granted immunity by class and context. When a gentleman believes observation is not responsibility. When the world is treated as an exhibit rather than a moral field. If you want the clean explanation, you can claim the jungle corrupts men. You can claim Africa is the darkness that turned Europeans into monsters. That story is comforting because it preserves Europe's innocence and relocates evil into geography. But the evidence points somewhere else. The darkness is procedural. The darkness is the system that can call a private domain a free state. The system that can route a rescue mission through an extraction corridor because it's convenient. The system that can partner with slave networks and still speak the language of civilization. The system that can split an expedition, abandon a rear column to rot, and later censor what happened as if horror is a typo. Because Empire's most refined technology is not the gun, it's the edit. Stanley's censorship is not a footnote. It is the final mechanism that completes the machine. The act is committed. The witnesses die. The narrative is published clean. The scandal breaks only later, diluted by distance and the convenient fact that the accused cannot testify. And society reacts the way societies always react when truth threatens identity. It debates credibility instead of confronting structure. It treats the murdered child as a detail in a reputational battle. It argues about sketches. It argues about intentions. It argues about whether a gentleman could really do such a thing. And through that debate, the machine wins time. Time is what power buys with silence. So, what was the expedition's true purpose? To save Emin Pasha? That's the official answer. But notice what happens when Emin refuses rescue. The expedition does not stop. It improvises. It gathers more men. It forces decisions. It keeps moving. A mission that can survive the collapse of its moral pretext was never powered by that pretext. It was powered by something deeper. Ambition, ownership, control, the need to justify itself. That's why the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition matters historically. Not because it is uniquely evil in a century of imperial evil, but because it is uniquely exposed. It left behind documents, diaries, statements, newspaper fights, a visible crack in the humanitarian façade. And through that crack, you can see the underlying architecture of modern domination: make violence necessary, make necessity respectable, and make respectability defensible with paperwork. Now return to the girl, unnamed in the public record. The empire didn't record her name because names create responsibility. A number, 6 handkerchiefs, is easier to handle than a person. A person has family, history, voice. A person makes the transaction unbearable. So, she becomes anonymous, and the anonymous become expendable, and the expendable become the foundation of progress. That is the final betrayal. Not that she died, though that is horror enough, but that her death could be converted into a debate about someone else's honor. So here is the ledger entry we close with. The expedition didn't merely fail. It succeeded in revealing what it really was. A system that could devour hundreds, erase the worst, and still return home to applause. Until the paper trail began to speak. And paper always speaks eventually. If you value the historical record, subscribe. Because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak.